Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old Fourth Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
So the Georgia General Assembly is in action, doing exactly what folks thought they would do, starting with issues that don't mean a damn thing to the vast and overwhelming majority of Georgia's citizens. Almost exactly as predicted by a friend of the show, columnist Jay Bookman from the Georgia Recorder, who wrote that Georgia GOP lawmakers, here's the headline, pick on trans people in a cynical play for votes. I have put in a call for him. If he's got time to join us, I'd love to have that conversation with him. In the meanwhile, I'll just dive into the column a little bit, and then we'll dive into some of the news from yesterday under the Gold Dome. Look at the world around us, he writes. On the scale of injustices that government can and should attempt to correct, transgender women competing in female sports should barely rank a footnote. In the entire state of Georgia, the number of transgender students competing in high school sports is 0. Largely because the phenomenon is rare in the first place and also because it is already against state regulations. Yet our state attorney general, who is running for governor, is treating it as a major civil rights scandal that must be corrected as soon as possible, even though it is already, quote, righted under Georgia law. Our lieutenant governor, Jay Bookman writes, who is also likely to run for governor, says that protecting women against transgender competition, quote, will be a priority during the 2025 session, which opens January 13th. He wrote this on January 9th, and damn if he wasn't exactly right. Let's pivot to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Maya Prabhu, Michelle Baruchman writing, Republican senators spent their first day of the General Assembly legislative session solidifying their plans to go after their favorite targets, Georgia's transgender community and Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis. Early Monday, State Senator Greg Dolezal, a Republican from Cumming, filed the chamber's first bill, which would require transgender girls and women competing in sports at public middle schools, high schools, and college student athletes to play on teams, dress, shower, and use restrooms according to the gender on their birth certificate. The bill would also apply to out-of-state and private institutions in games they play against those schools. Dolezal said, I introduced legislation today that came out of the work of the Senate's Committee on Protecting Women's Sports. Dolezal served as chair of the Senate Special Committee on Protecting Women's Sports and said, it does exactly what we discussed in the committee. It will establish clearly in Georgia law that males are not allowed to compete in female sports in the state. Piling on, in a news release, Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones said the Senate is on, quote, the right side of a common sense issue. Prabhu and Baruchman write, Jones is expected to seek the Republican nomination for governor next year. Republicans have spent the past few years focusing on regulation of transgender people, which they say is a winning issue among their base. Jay Bookman definitely points that out in his column, actually. Why so much attention to an issue that affects almost nobody? Bookman questions, going back to his column. Because transgender Americans are an unpopular, powerless, and almost friendless subgroup. That hurts my heart. He's not wrong. It just hurts my heart. Which makes them the perfect target for politicians willing to leverage that unpopularity into votes. Seriously, let's stop and ponder that for just a second. Transgender Americans, Bookman wrote, I'm repeating, are an unpopular, powerless, and almost friendless subgroup, which makes them the perfect target for politicians willing to leverage that unpopularity into votes. It's sick, it's twisted, it's godless, dare I say. I'm an atheist. I'm an atheist who grew up in a Baptist church and tried as best I could to pay attention to the morality laid before me and the scripture with direct quotes of Jesus himself. And I don't remember any of this sort of activity being taught in Sunday school or in sermons. Back to Bookman. With all the major issues confronting our country, there's a reason that Donald Trump and the Republican Party spent so many advertising dollars on the politics of transgender Americans. Bookman writes 2 words: it works. What does that say about us as a society? Again, I'm preaching to the choir here. I realize most of you who are listening on liberal progressive radio stations or who listen to this podcast because that is your ideology, I'm not speaking to you. But we do live in a society and are part of that society and have to, in some ways, have some sway on that society. And yet, it's so disheartening. It's so gut-wrenching. We are losing the battle to craziness, to meanness, to divisiveness, to pure, unadulterated hatred. I know I keep circling the plane back to this runway, but again, why so much attention to an issue that affects almost nobody? Bookman says because transgender Americans are an unpopular, powerless, and almost friendless subgroup, which makes them the perfect target for politicians willing to leverage their unpopularity into votes. In my mind, it's no different than picking on the weird kid at school. You know, that scrawny, weird kid who wears hand-me-down clothes, the cheapest glasses, the $10 haircut at the mall, if that. Bags their lunch, bologna sandwich. Tell me, why does the prototypical school bully pick on that kid? Well, let's apply Jay Bookman's line to that. That kid gets picked on because that kid is an unpopular, powerless, and almost friendless foil, which makes them the perfect target for the school bully. That's what we have running the show in the Georgia General Assembly, the governor's office, now the Senate, in a matter of, well, the Senate already, the House, and in a matter of days, the White House. Bookman continues furthermore, by focusing the debate on sports competition, those seeking to pick on transgender Americans have found a way to recast them as the perpetrators of injustice rather than its victims, which is like real sadistic, if you ask me. Bookman says somehow the daily indignities faced by transgender Americans, including something as basic as finding a safe restroom, vanish into the ether when someone mentions that someone somewhere might someday be asked to compete against a transgender person in sports. It comes down to a basic question, Bookman writes. What makes you more uncomfortable? Transgender people or the way transgender people are treated in this society? Yes, absolutely. That's a question we should be asking ourselves all the time. And asking these hateful politicians, Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, Greg Dolezal from Cumming, Georgia. What makes you more uncomfortable? Transgender people or the way transgender people are treated by society? Clearly, Republicans like Georgia's Attorney General and Georgia's Lieutenant Governor, Senator Greg Dolezal from Cumming, Marjorie Taylor Greene in the U.S. House, Nancy Mace, inexplicably and suddenly here in the last few months, also serving in the House from South Carolina, despite having once professed to being an LGBTQIA plus ally. Clearly, they've decided that either transgender people make them uncomfortable or make enough voters uncomfortable that it's an opportunity for them. Think about that. And consider again, Nancy Mace, formerly an LGBTQIA plus ally, clearly isn't uncomfortable with transgender people, even though now apparently she has to share bathroom space with the first openly transgender representative in the House of Representatives. Remember all the noise she made about that? Yeah, the House didn't even deal with that rule. It suddenly became not that big of an issue for her or them. because it was all about the attention and the opportunity to gin up votes. That takes me back to what Bookman says here. It is also, however, a question of priorities and strategy. If there are very few, if any, transgender athletes being denied the right to compete in Georgia, if other indignities faced by transgender Americans are considerably more important in their lives, then perhaps that is not the fight that ought to be fought at the moment. House Speaker John Burns has already pointed the way, saying his chamber will work this session to pass a bill codifying the ban on transgender women competing in sports, but will entertain no other legislation seeking to target the transgender community. Those in his party seeking higher office will get the campaign credential they seek, but that's where the line will be drawn. It's a good compromise, Bookman writes. I suppose on the surface, he's not wrong. And I can appreciate House Speaker John Burns sort of drawing that line, creating, sorry to use this analogy, a bit of a fire line a little bit. That's what some fire departments do to prevent a fire from going any further. They burn ahead in a line to stop the fire from getting any further by burning any vegetation that it could come across to stop it right there. I can appreciate that. And I certainly understand the conversation needing to be had with regards to transgender participation in sports. We know the International Olympic Committee, we know the NCAA has relied on the science, and I think we're still pretty much in the formulative years of that science. In the meanwhile, it's super easy. It's low-hanging fruit. It's, as we pointed out, it's opportunistic for politicians who rely on bigots to vote to simply knee-jerk react and say, nope, can't do that. It's easier to do that than to try and find ways to offer inclusivity for kids who wish to participate in intramural or interscholastic athletes, and to wander into conversations about which bathroom somebody uses at a public school. To me, that's the easy part. There are plenty of facilities in most schools. Good grief, I walk into a Target or a department store or any sort of public facility where there's a family changing room. Guess what? That is a multi-gendered bathroom. How many gas stations do you stop at where there's one bathroom? There's a toilet in there. And ladies, you better hope the fellas had good aim, right? I mean, you want to get icky about something? Let's get icky about that, fellas. Not whether or not someone who's transgender might sidle up to the stall next to you. Or ladies, someone who is a transgender female might also saunter into the same bathroom to wash her hands after using a private stall in the same room as yours. I want to go back to the school bullying analogy because I think it's apt. You're acting no better than either the school bully or the person who sits there and lets the school bully get away with bullying simply because the target is unpopular, powerless, and almost friendless, making that person the perfect target for bullies to bully. Back to Jay Bookman's piece. In the early 90s, Bill Clinton lacked the votes and public support needed to let gay Americans serve openly in the military, but his compromise policy of don't ask, don't tell at least gave gay service personnel some protection. It was progress. The principle of equal treatment had not been surrendered, even if the means of accomplishing it had changed. As a result, by 2008, Barack Obama could run and get elected on an explicit policy of ending the ban on gay Americans serving openly in the military, and by 2011, he had done so. Obama himself could and did triangulate in a similar fashion, zigging and zagging to get to a goal that he could not have achieved directly. In his 2008 campaign, Obama said he opposed gay marriage, arguing that marriage is the union between a man and a woman. By the 2012 campaign, observing that both he and the country had evolved on the issue, Obama openly supported gay marriage, which soon became legal in all 50 states. In parentheses, Bookman writes, ensuring it remains so may prove a challenge. Because again, we have to go back to the whole unpopular. Bookman concludes, again, the principle of equal treatment was not surrendered, even if the course taken to accomplish it had changed. You don't want to leave anyone behind, but you also can't achieve everything all at once. I'll include this, of course, in the show notes at ronshowatl.com, as well as Maya Prabhu, Michelle Baruchman's piece in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution covering the first day of activity under the Gold Dome with the Georgia General Assembly. We'll talk a little bit more about that and, of course, the other whipping post that the GOP relies on so readily here in the state of Georgia, Fonnie Willis, when the Ron Show returns. Feel free anytime you're listening, if you'd like to call the show and leave a voice note. I use those on occasion. 404-919-2725. Thank you for listening to The Ron Show. Follow us on your preferred social media platforms at Ron Show ATL, Blue Sky, Instagram, Threads, Facebook. What did I leave out? Oh, Twitter X. And yeah, I'm not abandoning any of those because of whatever blowhard owns it or runs it or what their pivot politically turns out to be. By the way, there'll be a furtherance of this discussion when Jeff Graham from Georgia Equality joins me. Either going to have him on tomorrow or the next day. Unsure. We'll just kind of play it by ear. Dr. Genevieve Gunther, who is a climate change expert. We've had her on the show before. She will be joining me as well. I'm actually, here in full transparency, I'm having these conversations later today. Don't know which day I'll air those shows, but we'll kind of wing it there. I want to go back a little bit to the AJC piece, Maya Prabhu, Michelle Baruchman writing. Biological men do not belong in women's sports, period. Burt Jones, Lieutenant Governor, who created a panel to study transgender girls in sports last summer. Remember, there are no transgender girls participating in sports in the state of Georgia. The day after Algerian boxer Imani Khalif's gender was questioned following her defeat of an Italian boxer in last year's Paris Olympics. Here's the next line. Khalif is not transgender, but the controversy around her participation in the 2024 Olympics spurred some Georgia lawmakers to take a closer look at transgender student athletes. I would argue perhaps the word anyway should be added to the end of that line. Because facts be damned. A quote from Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones is the very next line. This is common sense to everyone but the most radical liberals in Georgia. Here's something that really perplexes me. As a society, we are supposed to elect people to represent us at local, county, state, federal levels. People who we presume are better than we would be at enacting policy that serves the greater good. I hate to break this to the bigots, but the greater good is sort of all-encompassing. It's universal. Like, it's so easy to work on legislation that inhibits people or prohibits people from being able to participate in as much as is allowed societally. It's much easier to enact bans, to create obstacles, than it is to find ways to ensure that everyone has equal opportunity, whether it be to participate in physical education class activities or intramural or interscholastic sports, or for crying out loud, just to be able to go to a bathroom comfortably without worrying that somebody's going to question their having the right to use that bathroom. It's way more easy to enact the obstacles. America's history is rife with politicians who legislate together obstacles for equality. And the list is a lot shorter. The years are a lot fewer where politicians enacted legislation and governors and presidents signed into law such legislation that broadened opportunity and equality. It's something ingrained, unfortunately, in this country's DNA. Inequality is really easy for conservatives, for white men, for today's Republican Party. And equality is something that not only is difficult for them, it's something that repulses them. Why do you think we see so much backtracking on issues of diversity, equity, and, here's that word, inclusion? Inclusion. It's like a monkey fumbling a football. They look at it and they don't know, well, what do I do with this? Can't put my hands right. How do I? They don't know how to deal with it. They don't know how to legislate for equality, for inclusion, and they're certainly scared as hell of the word diversity. I mean, we've been hearing arguments for the last few days that apparently hiring female and lesbian firefighters in Southern California is why the wildfires are ravaging Southern California. Really, it's not the hydroclimate whiplash. It's not the arid, dry conditions of the last 9 months after extreme wet conditions for the last 2 years caused by climate change. It's not that. It's female, lesbian. That's a double. It's lesbian firefighters. I'm trying not to laugh, but that's some funny shit. Okay, Special Counsel Jack Smith's partial report came out. We dive in. Next on The Ron Show, America One Radio, Progressive Voices via TuneIn.
This is The Ron Show on America One Radio.
Let's go to the early morning hours and CBS News with this breaking stuff.
But first, this breaking story for you overnight. Part 1 of the final report on the investigation into President-elect Donald Trump by former Special Counsel Jack Smith has been made public. It details his investigative findings in the federal 2020 election interference case. And it reads in part, quote, "The office assessed that the admissible evidence was sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction at trial." In response to that report, Trump posted on Truth Social early this morning, calling it, quote, "fake findings."
No less than a toddler going, "Nuh-uh, am not." It's what he does. It's fake. That's all he's got. It's fake. I'm going to go to ABC News reporting on this now. Catherine Falders, Alexander Mallon, Pierre Thomas, Peter Shiralabu, Lucian Brueggemann. I hope I got those names right. Special Counsel Jack Smith's final report lays out in no uncertain terms federal prosecutors' position that Donald Trump, who is set to be inaugurated president in less than a week, would have been convicted on multiple felonies for his alleged efforts to unlawfully overturn the results of the 2020 election had voters not decided to send him back to the White House in the 2024 election. Back to me thinking, what does this say about us societally? And you know what? We've had time since last November to bathe in that toxic water. That was one of the primary conclusions, the article continues, included in Jack Smith's final report in his election interference investigation, which the Justice Department released early Tuesday morning after a federal judge late Monday night cleared the way for the report's release. Thank you, Eileen Cannon, for your last-minute flicker of justice. I question why. I'm at this point, you have to wonder, what's her motive here? To me, it just seems pretty clear this is like lobbing a softball for the partisans on either side to go back and forth, and for the Trump team to use the word lawfare again. Just, keep that stirred up. We already have a convicted felon whose sentencing, although there wasn't much of a sentencing, is sealed. We, on January 20th, will have the first convicted felon sworn in as President of the United States. There's nothing that even Eileen Cannon can do about that. The report continues here. The report lays out the probe that resulted in Trump being charged in 2023 with 4 felony counts of undertaking a, quote, criminal scheme to overturn the results of the 2020 election in an effort to subvert democracy and remain in power. Trump pled not guilty to all charges. Fake charges. The case, as well as Smith's classified documents case against Trump, was dropped following Trump's re-election in November due to a long-standing Justice Department policy prohibiting the prosecution of a sitting president. You can thank Merrick Garland for slow-walking even the beginning of this investigation into prosecution in the first place. Merrick Garland was supposed to be a Supreme Court justice, right? Remember that? He had been the nominee of President Barack Obama as Barack Obama was on the way out, but needed to name a successor. Mitch McConnell, of course, the Senate Majority Leader at the time, said, "Oh, well, we shouldn't have Supreme Court nominations in the heat of a presidential election." He, of course, went back on that 4 years later and let Trump put another body on the Supreme Court, which is why we have the 6-3 majority that the conservatives have, instead of it, at the very minimum, a 5-4 majority, with Justice Roberts often, I say often, enough times, well, not enough, but sometimes being that swing vote. I digress. Back to the article. The department's view that the Constitution prohibits the continued indictment and prosecution of a president is categorical and does not turn on the gravity of the crimes charged. Let me add in parentheses, the strength of the government's proof or the merits of the prosecution, which the office stands fully behind, the report said. Indeed, but for Mr. Trump's election and imminent return to the presidency, the office assessed that the admissible evidence was sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction at trial, which is exactly why Trump's attorneys did everything they could to draw this out, which is why he even ran for re-election. I mean, there are many people who believe that Trump ran in 2016 not to win the office of the presidency and was sort of stunned, as most of us were, and unprepared to govern, unprepared to govern when he won the presidency the first time. The second time, I'm not so sure he was running for office to win it again as much as to avoid prison time, to avoid prosecution. And obviously, winning this time meant more to him because he could circumvent any repercussions should he lose in the courtroom. Now, that, of course, doesn't include the state of New York or even the state of Georgia's case, and we'll get to that in a little bit, as Georgia Republicans, again, are looking at Fani Willis and trying to figure out how to decimate her, even though she's technically not even supposed to be handling the case anymore. But, you know, bully's got a bully. After conducting interviews with 250 witnesses, back to the article from ABC News, voluntarily calling 55 people to testify before the grand jury, executing dozens of subpoenas and search warrants, and sifting through a terabyte of publicly accessible data, Smith's team concluded that they could convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump committed multiple federal crimes when he attempted to overturn the election, the report said. Doesn't that just give you the warm and fuzzy feeling knowing that we're 6 days away from letting that get sworn in to be the president of the United States? Doesn't it just make you swell with patriotism? Proud to be an American. The through line of all of Mr. Trump's criminal efforts was deceit, knowingly false claims of election fraud, and the evidence shows that Mr. Trump used these lies as a weapon to defeat a federal government function foundational to the United States democratic process, the report said. For the first time, the report shed light on the internal deliberations of the prosecutors who sought to prove that Trump, quote, engaged in an unprecedented criminal effort while navigating the uncharted legal territory of charging a former president. Listen to this. While prosecutors considered charging Trump with violating the Insurrection Act, Smith wrote that he opted against the approach because of the, quote, litigation risk that would be presented by employing this long dormant statute. And what he's saying is, we haven't had somebody try an insurrection in this country in so long that we found the statute hard to use. According to the report, prosecutors worried that Trump's actions did not amount to an insurrection because he was already in power, technicality, rather than challenging a sitting government when the riot took place. Smith also noted that his office did not obtain, quote, direct evidence of Trump's, quote, intent to cause the full scope of the violence that occurred on January 6th, which I fully understand. I watched a lot of mob movies in my time. I've read a lot of journalism about mobsters and gang bosses. They don't want to know the full scope of details. They don't want to give explicit descriptive orders of how a hit takes place. They just want the hit to take place. And they use coded language to ensure that the message is given to the goons that have to go out and carry out the hit. Back to the article. Smith also noted that the case against Trump presented unique challenges, including Trump's ability and willingness to use social media to target witnesses, courts, and prosecutors with, quote, threats and harassment. Essentially, oh my God, he's also running for office, and we have to let him run for office, and the Republican Party can't be trusted to primary him out, and oh my God, he's got enough of the base that he could probably wrest that nomination, and once he's the nominee, it's a coin flip. Yeah, this is unique territory. We are going to have a convicted felon president because the Republican Party didn't have the wherewithal to stop him, let alone the first time. The second time, The second time, to me, is more damning. We've already endured a 4-year term with the post-turtle as president. You know what the post-turtle is, right? You come across a turtle atop a fence post, and you're like, what is he doing here? Doesn't belong here. We've already experienced that. We knew what the potential calamity can be. And the second time, without the guardrails of establishment Republicans, at least surrounding him, flanking him, it promises to be worse. And yet Republicans did not take their responsibility in a two-party government to see to it that didn't happen. Yeah, so I guess threats and harassment are a very real thing for all of those people who testified. What were the numbers again? Let me go back here. It was 250 witnesses voluntarily, 55 people testifying before the grand jury. Many of them, by the way, Republicans, and I'm sure enough of them had to be compelled to do so despite their best interests. The vice president at the time, his life was imperiled, so I guess I could understand why there might be some other Republicans who are like, do I have to testify? It's a little dangerous out here. Back to the article. Like any other case involving a conspiracy, prosecutors also expressed concerns about convincing witnesses to cooperate while the defendant still exerted influence and command over his alleged co-conspirators. That dynamic was amplified in this case given Mr. Trump's political and financial status and the prospect of his future election to the presidency. Well, I just went off on a rant before that line. I apologize. I should have done it the other way. Despite those concerns, Smith's report laid out how prosecutors plan to rebut Trump's expected arguments to secure a conviction, laying out a play-by-play for how a trial would have proceeded had Trump lost the election. The woulda, shoulda, coulda. If the former president argued that he acted in good faith when he claimed there was election fraud, prosecutors would present, quote, strong proof that Trump himself knew his claims of fraud were false. The report noted that Trump repeatedly noted in private how he lost the election, while telling his base that he hadn't. Including berating Vice President Mike Pence for being, quote, too honest. There's such a thing. To challenge the results, telling his family, you still have to fight like hell, even if he lost the election. And remarking to a staffer, can you believe I lost to this guy? I'm sorry. The line says, can you believe I lost to this guy after seeing Biden on television? This was not a case in which Mr. Trump merely misstated a fact or two in a handful of isolated instances. In the report, on a repeated basis, he and co-conspirators used specific and knowingly false claims of election fraud. If Trump argued he was following the advice of his lawyers, prosecutors planned to present evidence showing that his lawyers were acting as accomplices to the crime, preventing Trump from legally being able to employ the argument. And if Trump argued that he was just using his First Amendment right when he challenged the election, prosecutors planned to highlight that Trump employed his statements to commit other crimes, including using false statements to defeat a government function, obstruct an official proceeding, and injure the right to vote. Does this include the Coffee County election data breach? Does this include the call to the lieutenant governor of Georgia? I'm sorry, the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger? Oh, I'm sure it does, right? The fake electors? This has all got to be in there, right? Next line, the officers were cognizant of Mr. Trump's free speech rights during the investigation and would not have brought a prosecution if the evidence indicated he had engaged in mere political exaggeration or rough and tumble politics. The conduct of Mr. Trump and co-conspirators, however, went well beyond speaking their minds or contesting the election results through our legal system. In the report, the article from ABC News continues. Smith had detailed multiple interviews with various so-called fake electors, who he said sought to cast votes for Trump and admitted they would not have done so, quote, had they known the true extent of co-conspirators' plans. Smith told how investigators obtained signal messages. That's a messaging app, covert messaging app, where co-conspirator 4, previously identified by ABC News as former DOJ official Jeffrey Clark, sent a message to Representative Scott Perry saying he had received a highly classified briefing on foreign interference in the 2020 election that, quote, yielded nothing to support allegations of a stolen election. Bottom line is there is nothing helpful to P. I'm guessing that's Trump. Clark's message said, according to the report. The report cites the handwritten notes of former Vice President Mike Pence that the special counsel obtained, about which Smith wrote. In repeated conversations, day after day, Mr. Trump pressed Mr. Pence to use ministerial position as president of the Senate to change the election outcome, often by citing false claims of election fraud as justification. He even falsely told Mr. Pence that the Justice Department was finding major infractions. Regarding the House Select Committee's investigation into the January 6th attack on the Capitol, the report said that the probe only, quote, comprised a small part of the office's investigative record, and any facts on which the office relied to make a prosecution decision were developed or verified through independent interviews and other investigative steps. Now I'll pivot back to Georgia and Maya Prabhu, Michelle Baruchman's piece, first covering transgender legislation yesterday. Then on a 33-23 party line vote with Republicans supporting the measure, the Senate approved the continuation of a committee established to investigate Fani Willis. Greg Dolezal, Republican of Cumming, also sponsored that resolution. Democrats said the committee was politically motivated and targeted Willis because she charged President-elect Donald Trump and 18 of his allies for attempting to overturn Democrat Joe Biden's win in Georgia in 2020. And maybe there's a little more to investigate into this. I don't know. Does this coincide in any way, shape, form, or fashion? Mark Neese at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution reporting that there's a probe going into 2 state election board members' private Gmail accounts that were used for official business. 2 Republican state election board members who use private Gmail accounts for official business have refused to allow searches of their emails, leading to an accusation that they're violating government transparency laws. I'm sure that's absolutely nothing. I'll spend the last few minutes of today's show diving into that when we return. Looking at the clock, I got about 7 minutes left, so let me continue in on this piece from Mark Neese in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. 2 Republican state election board members, and you know they're part of the MAGA 3, who use private Gmail accounts for official business have refused to allow searches of their emails, leading to an accusation that they're violating government transparency laws. A lawsuit by the watchdog group American Oversight alleges that a state election board has systematically obstructed public records requests for information about voter eligibility challenges, communications with outside organizations, and voter citizenship verification. The 2 election board members, Janice Johnson and Janelle King, said they follow Georgia's open records laws and provide emails upon request, but they said they're unwilling to share their email accounts with government records officers. Then don't use that email. I mean, setting up a Gmail account is so easy, and you can set up multiples. So if you were, appointed to a state election board, maybe create a Gmail account specifically for the state election board role and just do official business on it. And then you just turn that over easily, right? I don't know. Then you're going to do the subversive stuff when it is what it is. When you become a public official, the term public means the public gets to know. Anyway, back to the piece. Without any outside review, there's no way to ensure that all requested emails are disclosed, said Lori Stark, an attorney for American Oversight. Under Georgia's Open Records Act, most government documents must be made available, including communications from personal accounts, if they're used to conduct public business. This is about transparency and the public's right to know, Stark said. It's hard to know when someone is doing their own search on their own emails whether they're ever truly turning over responsive documents. The state election board faced intense scrutiny leading up to last year's election, pushing through new rules for hand counting of ballots on election night and an, quote, inquiry by county election boards before certifying results. The courts threw out the rules, finding the board had exceeded its authority. Appeals are pending. Johnston, who was appointed by the Georgia Republican Party, said the board uses Gmail because the Secretary of State's office hasn't provided government email addresses, and she's uncomfortable with sharing her email password. How could I be sure that my emails were secure, not deleted, not edited, or not leaked to bad actors, Johnston said. And you know what? I'm not, color me shocked too. I'm not disagreeing with her on that. Why were there not email addresses given to those on the election board to conduct this is a Secretary of State shortcoming, if you ask me. Johnson said, I've been very diligent in my own ORR, open record request searches. Janelle King, who was appointed by Republican House Speaker John Burns, said she uses personal email addresses both for the state election board and for her role on the Georgia Board of Corrections, saying, "I do not have any agenda other than to do the right thing. I can't pick and choose what to send. I have to send whatever is asked in the ORR, emails, texts, etc. I prefer to manage my stuff, nothing more and nothing less." The 3 other members of the board also use Gmail accounts, but they permit the board's paralegal to conduct records searches because they have nothing to hide. Mark Neese at the AJC does a little historical review for us from last year. In response to records requests by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution last year, the board revealed hundreds of pages of emails. In some cases, it took several months to obtain the documents. Slow walking them. The emails include conversations with Republican County Election Board members about revising election certification requirements, allegations of inaccurate voter registrations, and complaints about Fulton County's handling of the 2020 election. ... from outside Fulton County. Additional emails obtained by the AJC last summer indicated that 2 election rules had been proposed by the Georgia Republican Party, the Georgia GOP writing the rules for the state election board members. There's nothing wrong with that, I guess. Outside influencers. Johnston also provided emails last week showing she requested a government email address in 2022, but it hadn't been provided by the Secretary of State's office. Hello, Brad Raffensperger, Gabriel Sterling. This is on you here. Also, Mark writes, Governor Brian Kemp vetoed $25,000 from the state budget. $25,000. He vetoed that from the state budget this year for a state election board website, which could have funded email services as well. Well, I mean, why would you do that? Why that one little line item? $25,000, Governor? Why? Seems curious. The culture of mistrust that has been created has caused board members not to want to give anyone unfettered access, said Mike Cohen, the board's executive director. Now, who created that culture of mistrust, Mike? Mark Neese writes, Johnson has asked the judge to dismiss American Oversight's lawsuit. Violations of the Georgia Open Records Act come with penalties up to $1,000 per violation and $2,500 for repeat offenses. Now there's a little money on the line. In a previous Open Records lawsuit by American Oversight, the group alleged that the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger's office, failed to provide election documents in response to 61 records requests over 19 months. The Secretary of State's office released thousands of pages of documents shortly before a court hearing in 2020 and later settled the case. I'll include this article, like I do all of the ones that I cite from, in the show notes at ronshowatl.com. Again, either tomorrow or the next day, or maybe they'll both be on the same day, depending on the conversations go. I'll be having some conversations later today that will be in a future episode or episodes of The Ron Show. Jeff Graham from Georgia Equality will be on to discuss the Georgia GOP's fixation on trans participation in sports and or what bathrooms they use in public facilities, etc., ad nauseum, and so on. Also, Dr. Genevieve Gunther, who is a climate scientist and has been on this show before talking about climate change last election cycle, as a matter of fact, before the results. We'll catch up with her and bemoan what the next 4 years will likely mean and the absurdity of bickering over who's to blame for the California wildfires instead of what is to blame. Also, this fixation lately to compare and contrast the North Carolina response by the federal government and the California response, when the California response is in its infancy. It's mind-boggling that we have to play the sibling at Christmas game. Who got more? Who got it faster? Who got it better? But that's where we are societally in this country. Never mind that you're comparing apples and orangutans. Anyway, that'll do it for today's Ron Show. I hear the music. Show notes again, ronshowatl.com. We replayed the show 5 p.m. weekdays on America One Radio. It airs initially at 9 a.m. in case you're wondering. On America One Radio, you can download the app. You can also listen to Progressive Voices via TuneIn at 11 o'clock or wherever you podcast. Have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow.